Welcome everyone to today's webinar, and thank you so much for attending. My name is Mona Harrington, and I'm the Assistant Director of CISA's National Risk Management Center, as well as the Government Co-Chair of the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management, or as we call it, ICT SCRM Task Force. For those of you who don't know about the task force, the ICT SCRM Task Force is one of the primary mechanisms for government and industry to collaborate on issues and solutions related to enhancing the security and resilience of the ICT supply chain. We have over 300 members, and I couldn't be more excited about all of the important topics that we are currently tackling, from AI to software assurance. Today's webinar will focus on the task force's recently published product entitled Empowering Small and Medium-Sized Businesses, a Resource Guide for Developing a Resilient Supply Chain Risk Management Plan. We are joined today by a distinguished panel of experts from our task force's Small and Medium-Sized Businesses Working Group, who developed the resource guide and who will bring a wealth of experience and insights on the specific supply chain needs of the SMB community. Throughout the next hour, they will delve into issues that the resource guide addresses, as well as the guide's key plan elements and suggested resources that are relevant to SMBs from all sectors. The guide provides ICT SMBs with a starting point to develop and tailor a SCRM plan that meets the needs of their business. Additionally, this product serves as a tool to support SMBs in developing an actionable SCRM plan to mitigate the risk of disruption to their supply chain, enhance their supply chain resilience, and satisfy potential requests from stakeholder procurement processes. I can't wait to hear more about it today. As you all know, the true strength of any great webinar lies in the active participation of its audience. So to our attendees, your thoughts and questions are invaluable. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and our panelists will address them towards the end of the webinar. So thanks again for joining, and I'll now hand the webinar over to Tamber Ray, who will be moderating today's discussion. Tamber, over to you.
So much, Mona. I am so happy to be here with all of you today, and especially the panelists that we have fortunate to join us in this particular webinar. As Mona indicated, the ICT SCRM Task Force is a really great resource for providing information to IT and comms companies, and then this particular working group has the benefit of getting the expertise of small and mid-sized IT and comms people directly, those that are involved in it day in and day out, coming together with government officials to identify what the needs are for small, mid-sized IT and comms providers, and then identify what is going to be useful for them and in what format. So these guides, like this one in particular, come together as a result of their expertise and what they're seeing day in and day out in their practice. And we're fortunate to be able to have the benefit of their expertise in deciding what's important. And then in turn, developing a guide that will be useful to other IT and comms providers. With that, I also wanted to specifically thank my co-chairs, Ola Sage and Jeff Goldthorpe, that also were an instrumental part of creating this resource guide for all of you. Also want to give a special shout out to our project management team. You don't see them listed anywhere, but we would not be here today. We would not have this guide without them in the background to navigate us and to steer us and to keep us on track. So big thanks out to all of you, Amanda Ingram, to Rebecca Adams, and to Brianna Alston for doing that important role that is unseen but so critical to making this come a reality. So with that, I want to introduce with the panelists that we have here today, that they are going to share with you their thoughts on this particular resource guide, how it came together, and how it can be useful to companies such as yours. So I'll start out with Dick, if you would introduce yourself.
Hello, Tamber. Thanks very much. And I completely agree. The team that Mona has working on this and pointing us in the direction that we're heading has really, truly been amazing to work with. And the success is proof is what we see here. So my name is Dick Brooks, and I'm a software engineer, and I'm a co-founder of Reliable Energy Analytics. I'll be providing a technical perspective from the standpoint of a small IT company providing software to the U.S. government and other industries for supply chain risk management. So I'm here to talk about my experience as a SCRM task force member from the IT sector. And this whole initiative really in this webinar, it really aims to answer the question that many SMBs have, and that is, what do I need to know and what do I need to do to protect my company from hackers using the software supply chain to attack? So this CISA work in this area has conducted a public-private partnership that really understood and considered the very real constraints of small companies like REA. And like many small companies, REA has constrained resources, especially budgets for cybersecurity. These CISA work products for cyber supply chain risk management are designed for SMBs with the practical constraints that SMBs live by every day, and to put these guidelines in reach for many of those companies. And as Mona mentioned, and I think Tamber also said, this CISA task force really is a model for public-private partnerships that really works and produces practical results that people can use. So thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Dick. And Chad, I'll turn it over to you next if you'd introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks. I'm Chad Cleaver, and I self-describe as a recovering CISO because after nearly 30 years in IT and InfoSec, I'm now over at ISC2, the world's largest cybersecurity membership and certification organization. And my role there is to help cybersecurity practitioners develop and maintain cybersecurity skills through training, education, events, and primarily really advocating for the cybersecurity profession. And that's exactly the angle I come at with the ICT SCRM Task Force. And I too am honored to be part of this group and to have been part of this group since its inception years ago in the communications sector and now through the IT sector, but most importantly through my past experience also in healthcare. The reason I find this so important, and especially our SMB working group, is throughout my career, I have been involved mostly small business and in nonprofits, almost my entire career. And I know how important it is for those folks that are trying to multitask, basically. And like Dick mentioned about having such such stretched budgets and stretched people, how do we really make this stuff work? And I know the SMBs out there that they don't have people that are dedicated to cybersecurity. And the question I hear all the time is, okay, we don't need another framework. We need to know how to make the frameworks we already have work. And how do we put this stuff to work? How do we make actionable, useful information out of it? And that's what my main goal here is. So thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks so much, Chad. And then we have Christopher, who is joining us from FDIC. Played a really important role in creating this document as well by bringing in his experience working on similar documents from the federal government perspective. So Christopher, if you'd introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Tamber. Just some housekeeping first. I have to say, as a federal employee, the opinions expressed here are solely my own and do not express the views or opinions of the FDIC. With that out of the way, I'm Christopher Calfee. I'm a senior risk analyst within FDIC's Office of Risk Management and Internal Control. I've been practicing enterprise risk management for over a decade now, both as a consultant on the private sector side and as a federal employee. Part of my portfolio within the FDIC was to spearhead our SCRM program. And as a part of that, I helped develop FDIC's SCRM strategy and implementation plan, which helped with, as Tamber said, the development of this document. And obviously, as a federal employee, I have a vested interest in supply chain writ large, and I'm here to provide that context within today's webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Today, what our purpose here is to try to provide all of you with a little bit more in-depth discussion of the different steps that we created as part of this particular resource guide. As small IT and comms providers are often faced with supply chain attacks, just like others, But they're particularly significant in the respect to small providers because there can be this perception that we're off the radar screen. And with supply chain attacks, they are completely random, and anybody that is within that supply chain is likely to fall victim if they don't take precautions. So we had that, in the background of what our thinking was as to why this was significant, as well as, of course, as we'll get into a little bit later, the fact that the government agencies, several of them, are starting to require some sort of supply chain resource management practice to be put in place. And, we thought that putting this plan together, whether you need it for government purposes or just in general to help defend against your own networks and your own products, if you're in IT, would be particularly helpful. So with that as way of background, let me jump into the first particular element that we decided in this plan, and that you might want to talk about here, Chad, from your experience. As you noted in your introduction, you bring together a lot of different experiences, whether it's healthcare, comms, and now even to the IT. And with that broad perspective, can you kind of lead us into this executive summary as to why it needs to have an executive summary and a plan, and what it's supposed to look like, and what should companies do when putting together an executive summary?
You bet, and thank you so much. And I'm happy to kick this off. Number one thing I like to say, executive summary. It is a summary. Keep that in mind. As you're doing this, and as you're working through this whole process, once again, I think we've broken down the most important steps, but realize there's a lot of things behind this, and we don't want to negate anything that might be out there as well. But as a general rule, what you want to do in this executive summary, keep it short. Keep it very much on point to what your business and what your executives want to read. So you want to make sure that you are grabbing their attention. You want to make sure that you are stating exactly what the goals, objectives, and the elements of your plan are. Very high level. And I strive to do this, and I know Tamber's going to like this one, because my rule is always, if it's longer than a page, nobody's going to read it. In this case, I'm going to say if it's longer than 2 paragraphs, nobody's going to read it. When you're talking about an executive summary, really 1 paragraph, excuse me, 3 to 5 sentences is the key. That's where you really want to be. So how do you do that, and how do you cram that in there? Well, here's what we're trying to solve. We're trying to keep an eye on our supply chain, but are we trying to be a roadblock in the process? No, we are not. We're trying to open the eyes of the business and see how supply chain relates to what our business does. Unfortunately, there's not a cookie cutter solution to do this for everybody. What you need to do is start with your business. What are your business's goals, objectives? What is your mission and vision? Start with that and say, how does supply chain affect that mission and vision? Grab those executives from day one and start from that point. And then how are you going to do it? Put in some specific steps. Now, we want to try to even be specific, even in this executive summary, about who is responsible for what. Don't name names, name roles, positions, but be very clear about what you want those executives to do and what their role in this whole process is. Best piece of advice I've ever had when it comes to an executive summary, tell them exactly what you expect from them. If you don't tell them that, they're going to make something up, and they will make the wrong choice every time, no doubt. So be sure, be very clear, be short, to the point. There's no need to do a whole lot of explaining, because they know what their business is, and as long as you're relating to the business, you're going to get straight to the point. You're going to get there quickly. Now, I say all that. We're talking about what you're laying out to start with. Now, the rest of the hour here, we're going to talk about all the other steps involved. We're starting with this summary. And sometimes you say, why am I starting with a summary instead of doing that at the end and summarizing everything else I've done? Well, this is really your roadmap. This is where you're going to get started with what you're doing. I guarantee by the time you finish the rest of these steps, that roadmap's going to change. You'll need to go back and revise, refresh a little bit. So don't think that this is written and this is my roadmap and this is the only road there is. Don't be afraid to make your own roads. And I'll pass it on to the others.
Yeah, anybody else want to chime in on Chad's comment there about the executive summary and kind of not overthinking it? Anything that you would recommend, how companies could go about creating it? Okay, we'll go on to the next step. So thank you very much, Chad. That I think you're right, that when you look at an executive summary, it's a case of at the same time knowing where to begin and not overthinking it to the point of keeping it simple and descriptive, but also recognizing that it's a start. So it may become clearer as you go through these different steps that we're going to go through next. And if you do need to make changes to the executive summary, certainly by all means, there's the opportunity to do that as you go along. But the idea is to just get a framework for starting out. And that leads into these next steps where, okay, now you've got this executive summary, identifying where your goal is and where you need to get. So to get there, the next step, that we identified in this particular working group, kind of following the logical order, if you're looking at a company and they're going through this, would be to identify critical suppliers and identify supply chain risks to your company. So, Christopher, I'm going to throw this off to you since you've got some experience with looking at this in the bigger picture, in your past experience. And any tips that you can provide companies of how do you narrow that down? How do you define what a critical supplier is, and how do you define, the supply chain risks? How do you know what those are?
Yep. Thank you, Tamber. One of the things that is really important, and especially with small and medium-sized business, as is in the federal context, is you need to be able to prioritize and understand and be realistic with what the amount of resources you have in order to manage your supply chain, because no one has an infinite amount. One of the things I've often said is, I don't care about napkin holders, but I do care about servers. And so we need to make sure that when we look at all of the assets that are coming in, that we prioritize the things that are most important. What are the critical items that we need in order for our organization to be successful, and then be able to prioritize and rank those assets and know who are the suppliers providing those assets, whether they're goods or services, because obviously we want to make sure that those who are going to do maintenance on whatever assets we have are also ranked and prioritized, so that we can make sure that we're doing correct risk assessments on those particular vendors. You can also then, once you have that list, you can then go about looking at how to do supply chain risk assessments, either on both assets and vendors. So you want to note things, and as we listed in the guide, things like, are you receiving your patches consistently? What's your process for dealing with end of life for IT assets? How are you coordinating with vendors on how they're managing their supply chains? Because it's really a team sport. Managing your own supply chain is then making sure that the people you're doing business with are managing their supply chains. And if they're not managing their supply chains well, that in itself is an inherent risk that you want to make sure that you address. But being able to understand that, again, comes back to prioritization. And then finally, you also want to make sure that these aren't static documents. So once you've created that list of critical assets, you've created that list of critical suppliers, that you don't just sit on that and say, well, that's our list till the end of time. Obviously, the environment changes very quickly, both in business and otherwise. And you really want to make sure that you're keeping pace with that. So as your business may shift and move, and as suppliers may come and go, you want to make sure that you always have that list of critical suppliers, and you always maintain that list of critical assets, so that you can pivot where need to, and also make sure and recognize that, given the limited resources you may have, that you are getting the most bang for your buck.
Great point, Christopher. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that approach is terrific. With just going through and listing everything, that identify your risks. Don't get so held up initially on the definition of critical. That am I right in thinking that once these companies are putting together their list of risks and what's important to them, then going back and prioritizing will be pretty easy. It'll kind of make it clearer.
Yeah, you need to know what you have. Obviously, you'd think that'd be table scraps, but having worked with a bunch of different agencies and private sector groups, that not is always the case, or it's not always the list that you have. Again, if it's static, may not be as accurate as you originally thought it was. Once you know what you have, you need to prioritize and figure out what's the most important. What are the things that if we lost it, we would not be able to perform our goals and objectives. Things would shut her down, and then prioritize those, make sure that those are higher up. And then you have to figure out what are your suppliers for those goods and services, and understanding, is it only, do we only have one supplier, or do we get it from more than one group? If you're getting it from that one group, can you get it from anyone else, or is it just from that one area? And then you have to then figure out of those suppliers, are they managing their own supply chains? And there are different ways to identify that. There are different tools and methodologies about getting information about vendors. And that's where the real work comes in. And again, the idea being that if you can minimize it so that you're really focusing on those most important pieces and those most important vendors, that you're making the most effective use of your time and resources.
Very helpful. And your point too about the fact that you can't just create this list and then walk away, your job is done. That supply chain risks change all the time. Your equipment may change, your software may change, your vendors may change. So it's one of those that, while this is a great starting point, it's not one that you can leave, and it's something to continually stay abreast of. So thank you. And I wanted to pick up, as it, the point that you made also, it ties into the next step that we have about supplier diversity. That one of the recommendations when it comes to, securing your network from supply chain threats is to have supplier diversity, so that, if something were to happen to one particular vendor or one particular piece of equipment, hopefully you have enough diversity built into your network or to your equipment, to your software, so that you're not entirely shut down and you're able to continue to function. You may have to work around it a little bit, but it's not absolutely dreadful to your operations. But from a small providers and small IT company standpoint, there's only so many dollars to go around. There's only so many vendors, so many pieces of equipment that are suitable for the type of work and type of operation that you do. So that was one of the struggles we faced as this working group, is how do you implement supplier diversity as a small company? And one thing that we have decided when we were kicking this around and had a lot of discussion in the background as to what that looks like, practical from standpoint, as opposed to, we didn't want to put something in there that just, this sounds good and is typical of what companies should do, but isn't realistic. So we put a lot of thought into how, in fact, a small company, in particular IT or comms, could implement supplier diversity in their own operations. And one thing we wanted to point out is that, it's not just the tangible equipment. It also applies to cloud services, for instance. That's a big thing these days, as well as third parties. So definitely you need to look at your vendors and make sure there's some security in place with them as well, as best you can. Another technique that we came up with in this regard was to identify a few single points of failure in your particular supply chain. Identify alternate suppliers where you can, in the event that one of those points should happen to fail. Again, that goes to the idea of making sure you, as much as possible, have a backup system in place, even if it's something that you don't use often and don't turn it on unless absolutely necessary. At least it's there in the event of an incident that would impact your ability to continue operating. Because if you're shut down even for a couple of days, it can mean significant amount of money loss. So while it's hard to come up with the notion of spending this money upfront for the possibility of something may or may not happen, you kind of have to, and I think this goes into what Christopher was talking about, the risks and benefits, and prioritizing, where those costs would come from, and what kind of expense you're able to recover from in the event of some sort of supply chain event. The other thing that I wanted to absolutely refer to, and Chad and Dick can probably weigh in on this too, because they were involved in this. One of the previous documents this particular working group put together was this SMB guide for operationalizing the vendor scrim template for small and medium-sized businesses. We put that together knowing that this type of situation is going to come up, but how do you then go about checking with your vendors? How do you know those vendors have certain security practice in place so that you're selecting one vendor over another that hopefully has more secure practices? I think that's definitely a guide that we would recommend. And again, invite Chad and Dick if you want to say anything about that as to why that particular guide would be useful, how to use that, and we can certainly put in the chat where you can find it on the ICT Scrum Task Force website.
Well, I think you nailed it, Tambra. That guide is very. It's really the essence of what this group was all about. Is tell them what they need to know, and tell them what they need to do, and that is exactly what that guide provides. Is very specific use cases, in cases where you can look at and say, if this happens, then this is what you need to do. And so that really is the essence of what the group was, aiming to do. And then, of course, we followed it up with this document. So the two documents really work as companions to achieve what Tambra is describing. Thanks.
Yeah, and then the final point I wanted to make with respect to this particular step of implementing supplier diversity, and Dick, I think you can chime in on this as well, and certainly Chad and Christopher, if you have anything. This partnerships that sometimes you can get additional buying power or additional, contract power, as it were. If you join up with other entities that are looking to purchase the same equipment, that perhaps using the same, cloud provider, maybe things like that you get more bargaining power, as it were, by teaming up. One example that comes to mind, within NTCA, for just getting equipment, knowing that small providers have a hard time doing that in many instances, and getting the availability, especially these days when there's so much broadband being built out. We worked with Corning to create a situation and an opportunity for NTCA members to purchase equipment that we're simply putting the two together, that we weren't selling the equipment itself or have any respect with that, but simply wanted to make sure that members had that opportunity to get equipment and order it in a set time frame if they needed it while it was still available. So I think, Dick, you've had sort of similar instances with the CISA Critical Manufacturing Sector Coordinating Council of creating more buying power.
Oh, got to find the unmute button. Yeah, that's very true, Tambra. In fact, the Critical Manufacturing Sector Coordinating Council just recently hosted a tabletop exercise for cybersecurity incident response. And it was aimed at manufacturers, but that includes a lot of different parties. FDA is a great example of working with manufacturers to get their cybersecurity practices in place that are intended to aid with different manufacturing level cybersecurity issues that need to be considered. And I know that this I don't know if this is a good time to talk about incident response, but that is certainly one case where incident response is really vitally important. And so if you look at risk management planning with that regard, you need to take a look at what's really important. And Scott Aronson over at the Edison Electric Institute has a great saying. He says that you really need to prioritize, and he uses the analogy, protect diamonds like diamonds and protect pencils like pencils. And I think that really does speak to what's important is to focus on those things that truly are important. So I can give you some sense for what's important with regard to incident response. is, it's just an area where we're all very familiar. We know incident response happens every day in our lives, stopping at a red light or avoiding debris on the road when you're traveling. So incident response is vitally important. And so planning is an important function that aims to respond to these cyber incidents, such as a ransomware attack. And so the incident response plan should set out recommended outlines for assessing, managing, and responding to these cyber incidents. If you're ever looking for a great example of incident response and incident response planning, go find the 5-minute clip from the movie Titanic at the moment when the iceberg is hit by the Titanic. It is a great example of incident response planning and incident response. So the first thing is you need to know what are your risks. And one of the key ingredients here, and this is one where CISA plays a major role, is in providing the community with warnings about cyber risks. And this is where the CISA KEVs are key. The CISA KEVs are known exploited vulnerabilities. And I like to think of these as almost like a weather radio alert warning of danger. When a CISA KEV alert comes out, it's time to take action immediately. And so this is a case where it really doesn't cost a lot for an SMB to implement these kind of safeguards. CISA KEVs are freely available. They are managed by CISA, and they have they have a very strict set of guidelines on what they report as a KEV. It has to be exploitable. It has to be a known vulnerability. So it's important for companies to subscribe to those CISA KEVs and use for their CISA risk detection practices, and they will help you locate or identify when things need to be addressed or responded to. One thing I want to follow up though too with what Chad and Chris were saying, and Tamber, is that management needs to provide the direction with regard to things like risk appetite and risk tolerance and recovery time objectives. So here is a case where you really need to know that when a specific incident occurs, that you have the plan in place that will implement the solution to get you back up and running. And here's where things like recovery time objective will help drive what you do. I use the analogy, if you're jumping out of an airplane and the parachute doesn't open, your recovery time objective is rather small. But if you're Apollo 13, the recovery time objective was a couple of days. So here's another case where you really need to know what your risks are, and having your incident response team, your cyber incident response team, positioned to address those. Each one of those is key. You'll need to, of course, identify the roles and responsibilities that they have as well. And so if you walk away with two things today, here's what I hope they are. Number one, enable MFA, because that is one way to keep the bad guys out. And the other is to monitor those CISA KEVs so that you're aware of the risks that are coming at you. They're like the cyber icebergs in your path that you need to be aware of and avoid. And so all of the people working on the cyber incident response team need to understand what the plan is and what needs to be protected and what the priorities are. And of course, they need to exercise that plan as well. How's that, Samber? Is that anything further on that?
Great advice there, Dick. Thank you. And absolutely, that brings up an excellent point that, well, 2 points sort of. There's so many opportunities here. That, first and foremost, that this is not the role just of IT. Within a company, everybody is going to play a part in supply chain and helping to secure things. But also, with the nature of supply chain, you got to look outside your company. It's not enough to just do everything you possibly can inside, but you also have to look at outside your company. You got to look at your vendors. And so, Chris, Chad, I'm going to throw the next question at you. The next step that this particular working group created for this particular guide was to develop a vendor attestation process. What does that look like, and how can companies do that?
All right, happy to take that one, Tamber. And when I get done with that, I'm actually going to circle back on the diversity a little bit more, just because you're going to see where it ties in here in just a second. And as I do this, I do see the question out there in the chat from Paul. And for those of you who aren't looking at the chat, the question out there was, as a small business, we found we don't have much pull with vendors to answer questionnaires. Any suggestions on how we can do that? And yes, I just so happen to have an explanation, and Vic and Tamber just talked about that. Got a really good example of how that works. And I think, yes, the second to the last chat out there, they posted the SMB vendor scrim template. It's a great product. It's the last product we put out from the SMB working group, where we took a ton of those questions and we picked out what we thought was the most important overall for you to concentrate on. Now, take that template, and there is actually a really cool, there's even an Excel version of it out there. Take that template and hone that down to what you think is the most important for you and for your business. Don't try to make it an all-inclusive questionnaire to go out there and get every piece of information you can from every vendor. Decide what's important for you, decide what's important for your business, concentrate on those most important ones. Now, I'll tell you, as an SMB, it is a huge challenge to get folks to do that and to get the big companies especially to play along. What you will see most of the time is they will say, great, here's a copy of my SOC report, go find your own answers. What you have to have at that point is we talked about a little bit about the executive buy-in, and you've got to have that executive buy-in to say, as an organization, we are committed to supply chain risk management. We are committed to ensuring that all of our vendors will comply with the rules we've set forward. It is definitely tougher as a small business, and as a small business, I'm usually willing to back off on that just a little bit. And work with those companies to do that. But a company who's just not willing to work or provide any information can be a big red flag. Now, I'll tell you, the big guys, they probably have it. They have it somewhere. It's finding the right people with the right answers. And unfortunately, as an SMB, I know you're pressed for time, but you're probably going to have to do some of that legwork yourself and go find that. Don't expect to just throw a questionnaire out there and that everybody's going to answer it exactly the way you think they will. Now, I will say that when we did that template, you're going to see there were some really important things out there. There was a yes, there was a no, and there was a maybe so option. So pay attention to those. Just because somebody answers yes or no doesn't always answer the complete question. That's why we put that maybe or partial box on there to open the dialogue so you can ask the relevant questions and what's really important to your organization. So as I say that, realize there's a lot of people right now that as we're trying to come up with that vendor attestation process, we're trying to figure out how do we make that work? How do we operationalize that within our company? Number one, if you've got legal group, reach out to your legal team. I realize once again, a lot of SMBs don't have a dedicated legal group, but they do this kind of thing all the time. So if you do have a legal team, involve them in the process. Don't think it's just an IT thing or just a cybersecurity thing. It definitely ties into legal. Now, the other side I'm going to say is there's a lot of folks that this is new. This is totally new, having to go out and figure out what our vendors are doing and making sure our vendors are staying safe for us. It's not new. Those folks in healthcare and finance, they've been doing this for a long, long time. And when I say a long, long time, I know I started out doing this back in healthcare and implementing HIPAA rules, and this is back around the 99 to 2000 time frame. It's been around 20 years. People have been doing this. So don't think it's something brand new and that you've got to come up with. The other side I'm going to tell you is don't think you have to go buy a shiny new Blinky box, fancy tool, new software package that, yes, you should check to make sure that you have to do this. I've seen some of the best vendor management plans, especially for small and medium business, put together in an Excel spreadsheet. You can do a perfect job with that. It doesn't require a ton of work or, like I said, some fancy new tool to take care of it for you. It's more about the process and raising the awareness. Once again, I can tell you at a particular small business that I've worked for in the past, I started putting this together and I started looking at just our software dependencies and what software vendors we rely on. I came up with a list of over 400 applications that were in use at that company. And I'm here to tell you, we had almost an application for every employee of the company is the way that worked out. Sometimes, and especially in even the smaller businesses, you probably have more applications than you have employees. So your important parts there, as you're thinking about developing this process, think about how it works within your organization. Ensure, I always back up to this, but make sure you've got that executive buy-in and that everybody's following the same process. And this is where it's going to be really important to set up those governance processes within your organization to make sure the organization as a whole is committed to the entire process. And that's really going to be your most important parts. So I said I was going to tie back a little bit into the diversity. As you're doing this, and I'm going to double down on what Dick said earlier, make sure you identify what parts are important to your business. Know what parts are important. Can you remove these parts? If you can remove these parts and keep on working, then maybe that's not something to concentrate on right now. Concentrate on those parts that if I remove this piece of software, if I don't have this piece of hardware available to me, if I don't have this, can we continue to function as a business? Because as critical infrastructure, we're all interested in continuing in the resilience. And that's really what we're trying to promote here is the resilience of our business and our ability to keep working in the face of a disaster. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about the diversity, as you're thinking about this, even this attestation process. It sounds like a pretty dry process, but that's really what you're trying to keep in mind is how do you keep the business running if one of your vendors should fail, and how can I keep track that those vendors are on top of their program as well? Because even you and even your vendors, even the best laid programs can fail. And so it's really your job to figure out how do you keep that failure from affecting your own business. And that's really the ultimate goal of that vendor attestation process. So I hope I helped answer your questions, and I'm going to pass it on for the next one.
That's really great, Chad. And I think resilience sums up supply chain in exactly the right word. And I think I've just discovered that the executive summary can be boiled down to one word, resilience. You don't have to have two paragraphs. So with that, I'm going to jump around just a little bit, so that it ties into that the discussion of what we've been having about how, yes, you have to look at your vendors. You also have to look in-house. So now that we've spent a lot of time, fortunately and importantly, talking about how to get information out of your vendors, especially noting the struggle that small providers and small companies have doing that. Okay, let's now look internally a little bit more deeply. How can you train your employees? Because, as you pointed out, Chad, yes, you got to have executive buy-in in order to be productive. So there's that piece. And we know it can't just rely on the IT department. Okay, so that's that piece. But what about the rest of the company? Christopher, can I toss this to you to talk about what companies should do to engage all and involve all the employees in supply chain risk management?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a topic near and dear to my heart, and I do want to echo what both Dick and Chad had said, and you as well. A tone at the top is very important for all of this. Making sure you understand your risk appetite, how much you're willing to take. It's good strategic sense, and it's good risk management sense, and it definitely builds into supply chain risk management. And when it comes to training, again, we're all going to sound a bit like a broken record in terms of, we all understand there's a limited amount of resources available. We need to make do with what we have. And especially when it comes to training, we have to think about, there may be people who have to wear multiple hats when it comes to, the acquisition lifecycle, and whether it's employees who are receiving assets, whether it's employees who are doing the acquisition part with contracting, or even those who are dealing with disposal of contracts. People may be doing one, two, or all three of those, but it's important then to identify who those key employees are and what they would benefit from in terms of supply chain risk management training. It's also good to, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, understand what kind of training you already have within house and where you may be able to incorporate supply chain risk management elements into existing training. So if you already are training people on how to establish the acquisition process and where to go, incorporating those SCRM elements that Chad was talking about in terms of dealing attestation and how you would both include that attestation process and how to review it once you've received it, in order to make good risk-informed decisions on vendors. But then you would also then want to do anti-counterfeit training, possibly for those that receive goods. Anti-counterfeit is a part of supply chain risk management. So do you need to train people on how to identify whether goods coming in may be suspicious or not, and what to do if that is the case? And then also when it comes to disposal, so as you were disposing of goods, whether it's IT assets or otherwise, that you're doing so in a way that's safe for your business, but also safe for your supply chain, and making sure that those goods don't turn up elsewhere with information from your company on there. So in this case, there may be a hybrid approach that works depending on what time and resources you have. You can do generalized training to give into a wider audience, so just the importance of SCRM overall, and that's a good start. But then there may also be better specialized training that then goes into, again, counterfeit goods. Counterfeit training may be good, but if you're doing contracts, it's not going to be of much use to you. But how to review a vendor attestation would be very useful, but if you're sitting on the docks receiving goods, that's not going to be very much use to you as well. So understanding what is best for you and given the resources you have, understanding who those key employees are who should receive that training, and also just understanding that, again, if we're talking about tone from the top and making sure that everyone is on board with the concept, a generalized SCRM approach may work in terms of understanding from that the whole organization appreciates supply chain risk management and its importance, and that's why we're giving this training, so that everyone sort of gets on board, where they may have to do additional work for supply chain, but they understand that it's important because you're getting it across the organization.
Great point. And one thing I just wanted to jump in on, with the employees is exactly what you said, that so much of this depends on where the company's needs are, what the company's skills are, where the employees, and I guess if I'm right, in one of the takeaways, Christopher, is kind of look at where the training needs to happen. And again, look at your priorities and look at your skills of the employees and what involvement they have, and then target perhaps specific training to their particular roles, to their particular environment, as opposed to maybe a one-size-fits-all. Here's your annual cybersecurity training. We're done. And it's something where it's a little bit more specific and looking at each company and each individual. And then the other part I wanted to bring up, and it really fits in well with one of the questions that was posted in the chat. When it comes to all the ICTs, supply chain risk management, and creating this guide, this resource guide that we did, where would you use it? What's the benefit besides the obvious of using it internally? The question came up about how is this going to help you, or will it help you look favorable, to the government if there's instances where there are, a supply chain attack that affects your company? Is it going to look better, for lack of a better word, if you at least have this in place to show that you had practices in place to try to account for it as much as you possibly could. And I'll just start out and ask the rest of you guys to please chime in based on your experience in-house with the companies and with the government. But in particular, as we alluded to at the beginning of this particular webinar, there are several instances now where the government is starting to require supply chain risk management plans. So, for instance, if you're going to go for BEAD funding with NTIA, that's going to be something that you have to have in place. Likewise, the FCC just came out with a rule that requires certain companies to have a supply chain risk management plan in place. And so while what we have created, through this working group isn't intended to be, obviously a plan, it isn't intended to help you in thinking through exactly those plans so that, when you're told to, if you want, if you're going to comply with BEAD requirements or with the FCC requirements, you have to have a plan in place. This guide, we're hoping, will help you think that through and at a level that makes sense and give you some concrete examples so that you can fulfill those requirements. But beyond that, I just wanted to give my co-panelists an opportunity to jump in and, expand upon that particular thought or in response to anything else you have for that question that's raised in the chat.
Hi, Chamber. Dick Brooks here. I was just putting some information out in the chat regarding that point. So I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to follow up on that Chris and Chad mentioned, and that's the whole concept of, sending suppliers questionnaires. I work extensively in the energy industry, and they were one of the earliest ones to send out questionnaires to their suppliers. And I think a lot of people were hoping it would really help them understand what the suppliers are doing, but the questionnaires just really didn't. They didn't have the desired effect, I would say. A lot of vendors received a lot of different questionnaires that weren't consistent, and it just created a tremendous amount of confusion. And the one thing that is worth mentioning, though, is that CISA and NIST are all moving in the direction of requiring suppliers to provide attestations. So instead of asking questions of the supplier, the attestation says, tell me what you do, and I will decide if it's good enough for what I need in my particular situation. So it's a movement away from those generic questionnaires to more along the lines of these attestations. And we see that with the CISA Common Forum and the NIST SSDF. There are attestations that tell you, here's what I'm doing as a supplier. Now it's up to you to analyze that and decide, is it good enough for you? Thanks.
Yeah, I see there's another question in the chat that also ties into the government question. And I know we only have a couple minutes left, so we can't give any great lengthy answers, but I did want to at least raise it and give the opportunity for the panelists to address it because it is a really important question about essentially how to spot foreign ownership of potential procurement source. Again, we're talking from a small business standpoint, where it's difficult to get even a list of maybe 10 questions answered, much less how do you identify the foreign ownership when that is absolutely going to be necessary. And again, referring back to both CISA and the FCC, where they have a rule, well, the FCC has rules in place and CISA has recommended following those rules with respect to foreign ownership when it comes to supply chains. So any advice there on how a small IT comms company could identify foreign ownership of a company when they're looking at vendors?
So, Timber, I'll take a shot at this. So, yeah, I think we can look at the guidance that's been coming out of CISA and NIST in this area. And even the SEC. The SEC makes it, I think, very clear that management owns cybersecurity. And starting in December, they're going to need to, submit attestations or disclosures, if you will, of what they're actually implementing for their cybersecurity processes. So management is key, executives are key, directors on boards are key, and really it's all about assembling a cyber incident response team and supply chain risk management committee that can lead the initiative. Thanks.
And thank you all very much. I'm going to refer it back to Mona now.
That was fantastic. Tamara, thank you so much for engaging us in such an informative and lively discussion about the resource guide. I also want to thank Dick, Chad, and Christopher for being panelists today. I would be remiss to not take a moment and also thank the SMB working group co-chairs, Ola, Tamber, and Jeff for all their hard work leading this effort, as well as the members of the working group for their dedication to this effort. It was a very thoughtful discussion with great guidance from all of you on how to approach a risk plan. Many takeaways, too many to mention, but a few I want to highlight. I'm going to quote Chad here because I have a deep appreciation for what he said. We need actionable, useful information with existing frameworks. We also heard from Christopher on how important it is to focus on prioritizing resources by ranking assets and knowing the suppliers, and also the importance of building agility into those plans. They can't be static. Tamber highlighted how important it is to weigh the merits between the risks and benefits of investments to rapidly recover from an event. Also, the importance of training and skills and to tailor training to what's most appropriate and beneficial. Dick reminded us of knowing your risks, your risk appetites, RTOs, and the importance of robust incident response. And he described the essence of the guide as tell them what they need to know and what they need to do. To that end, I encourage you to visit the task force website to learn more about the SMB resource guide and catch our video on the product, and also learn about all of the other resources that your organization can utilize to enhance supply chain resilience. I encourage you to take the quick survey on the site to provide us with feedback on the SMB resource guide, because your input helps make our future products even better. Thank you again.